No one saw the black sails at first. The ships drifted into the harbor as quietly as shadows, carried by a wind that smelled of salt and something far more sinister. When the townspeople finally approached, they found sailors slumped over ropes, lifeless bodies scattered across the deck, and only a handful of survivors, too weak to stand, whispering of a sickness that killed faster than a sword. Within days, the disease leapt from ship to shore. Within months, it devoured entire cities. And within a few terrifying years, it carved its name into history as one of the deadliest forces ever unleashed on humanity. This was not the first plague humanity had faced, but what began in the mid-14th century would evolve into something far larger, far more relentless, a haunting saga that historians now call the Second Plague Pandemic, a wave of outbreaks that lasted not for years or decades, but for nearly 500 years. Its opening act is known around the world, the Black Death. Europe's population would later describe it with an almost reverent horror, as if the disease were a demon that had walked among them. Imagine the fear of watching your neighbor fall sick in the morning and see their body carted away by nightfall. Reports tell of swellings the size of eggs rising beneath the skin, fevers that burned without mercy, and a sense of dread that settled over cities like a physical weight. Some chroniclers swore they saw the end of days in motion. Others simply stopped writing, overwhelmed by grief. But the true story of the Second Plague Pandemic stretches far beyond the iconic images of plague doctors and deserted European streets. It begins on the other side of the world, in the vast trading networks of Central Asia. Caravan routes crossing grasslands and mountains carried goods, ideas, and travelers, but they also carried stowaways, fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, a microscopic bacterium with the power to reshape civilizations. Mongol armies, merchants, refugees fleeing conflict, all unknowingly became part of the disease's spread. The world was more connected than we imagine, and the plague took full advantage. One legend describes a siege at a Crimean port where attackers, stricken with the disease, catapulted infected corpses over the walls in desperation. Whether fact or myth, the story symbolizes a chilling truth. Plague often traveled with the movements of armies, and it thrived in times of fear. When it finally exploded into Europe in 1347, the continent was wholly unprepared. Villages vanished, entire families disappeared within a week. Some towns erected walls to keep strangers out. Others held frantic processions to beg for mercy. Many blamed outsiders, foreigners, minorities, travelers, seeking a human cause for something too monstrous to comprehend. Tragedy piled upon tragedy, as fear fueled violence alongside disease. Yet even as the Black Death ebbed, the pandemic did not end. The bacterium lingered in rodent populations, erupting again and again. The plague became a recurring visitor, striking with unpredictable fury. One generation would whisper the stories of a terrible outbreak, only for their children to witness it firsthand. In 1665, London was gripped by a resurgence so severe that residents fled in mass panic, leaving behind a city half dead and half deserted. Bills of mortality listed thousands of deaths per week. Red crosses marked the doors of the infected. People waited behind bolted shutters, listening for the rumble of the death cart. And then, with the Great Fire of London, the following year, plague finally disappeared from the city, burned away, some believed, with the flames that consumed its wooden streets. But elsewhere, the disease persisted. The pandemic rolled through the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Russia, and the Middle East. Cairo endured outbreaks so intense that chroniclers described corpses stacked like firewood. In parts of Persia, whole towns were recorded as being emptied. The plague struck coastal regions again and again, following the paths of sailors and merchants. Rural areas, too, were not spared. In Norway, some communities were so demolished by plague that they were never resettled. Even the rhythms of society changed. Labor shortages reshaped feudal economies. Survivors demanded higher wages. Landowners struggled to maintain their estates. Social mobility, once nearly impossible, opened like a door left ajar. The plague didn't only kill, it transformed. Behind all of this lay a mystery. Why did the plague strike some places repeatedly, while others escaped relatively unscathed? Medieval people blamed everything from foul air to astrological misalignment. They burned incense, carried herbs, and prayed. But none of it stopped the waves. As the centuries passed, the disease evolved in the minds of those who lived through it. It became a symbol of divine judgment, of human fragility, of the thin line between order and chaos. Entire generations grew up with stories of the plague. Like children today, grow up with fairy tales, except these tales were real, and they were terrifying. By the 1700s, something began to change. Outbreaks became less frequent. Some regions experienced their last major epidemic. Public health practices improved almost accidentally. Cleaner ports, more regulated trade, slight shifts in rat populations. But the pandemic still had one more devastating chapter. In the early 1800s, the plague struck again across the Middle East and Eastern Europe with deadly force. The Ottoman Empire suffered greatly. Alexandria and Baghdad reeled under massive losses. In Moscow, a panic-driven riot erupted after quarantine measures were put in place. The terrified population stormed the streets, convinced the government was hiding some terrible truth. And then, silence. By the mid-19th century, the second plague pandemic faded, leaving behind a centuries-long trail of death, restructuring, and resilience. Scientists would later debate why it disappeared. Was it better sanitation, changes in rat species, a shift in climate, or simply the end of a natural cycle? The answer remains uncertain, a final secret kept by a disease that shaped half a millennium of human history. What remains undeniable is the impact. The second plague, pandemic, rewrote societies. It ended dynasties. It reshaped economies. It hardened some communities and shattered others. And it left an emotional scar etched into the collective memory of continents. Every time a chronicler paused mid-sentence, every time a village vanished from a map, every time a survivor whispered their story to a child, the pandemic lived on. Even today, the echoes remain in abandoned ruins, in shifts in population, in folk tales passed down from terrified ancestors, in the architecture of quarantined ports and the strange medical masks of plague doctors, and perhaps most powerfully in our understanding of vulnerability, how microscopic forces can topple the mightiest kingdoms. The second plague pandemic is more than a historical event. It is a reminder of how intertwined humanity has always been, and how every connection, every trade route, every journey across oceans or borders has the power to unite us or undo us. And yet, through nearly 5 centuries of terror, humanity endured. It rebuilt, rediscovered hope, and carried forward knowledge born from suffering. The plague tested the world, and the world, scarred but standing, rose to meet the centuries that followed.